Folks, welcome to the Salim Ismail Podcast. I'm on with Vinay Gupta. We're super excited to be here. Vinay, welcome.
Good afternoon. How's it going?
Very well. You are based in the UK, in London, if I remember?
Yes, that's right. A little outside of London.
Okay, and I'm on the east coast of the US. We will go through a few topics today that I think are about as high level as we can get in conversations like this, future of civilization type stuff. Vinay, give us a little bit about your background on your path that led you to this point, and then Materium, because we'll end up wanting to talk about that as well.
Sure. So I spent my 90s in tech, starting out in VR and flight simulators, and then moving on to cryptography and content management systems, kind of bounced around a lot. Then after 9/11, I went into energy policy and then defense, security, and resilience think tanks, spent about 12 years doing that. And then 2014, I joined the Ethereum team as a project manager. I've spent the time since then doing blockchain stuff. And specifically what I specialize in is the legal technical interface so that you can have events happen on the blockchain and turn them into legally binding phenomena that will show up correctly in, say, a court case.
That we definitely want to delve into quite deeply, because I think you've hit on an underlying problem. In the same way that in the EXO ecosystem, we focused on solving the immune system problem, because if you can't solve that in legacy enterprises, you can't get anything done. I think you've hit on a similar problem space where if you can't solve the legal bridge from old to new, then it doesn't matter kind of how sexy the widgets are and NFTs are. You don't have an enforceable structure, right? And I think I'm super excited by that. All right, let me start from the beginning. You invented the hexayurt, right? Tell us what that is and what led you to that. What led you to doing that particular piece?
So I mentioned I've done a lot of graphics engineering. So I knew quite a bit of the math that you would use for doing things like geodesic domes. And in 95, I went to a sort of commune that was quite famous from the 60s that had done an enormous amount of work on appropriate technology. And they were building a lot of domes in those days. And they asked me, hey, could you use this math that you know to figure out how to make a dome that doesn't produce a huge amount of waste when you make it out of plywood? Because the plywood comes in fixed sheets, 1x2 rectangles. The spherical trigonometry of the Buckminster floor domes produces a lot of triangles which have strange ratios between the sides, and that makes it very hard to cut plywood sheet into those triangles without producing 25 to 40% waste. So they asked me to take a crack at that problem. I put about 6 months into it. Fixed a few typos in Buckminster 4 patents that were being used to make geodesic domes for places like Burning Man.
Amazing.
But did not have any fundamental breakthrough because we were still operating too closely inside of the four-world model. So that was the kind of 1995, 1996 run. Then 2002, there was an event called the Sustainable Settlements Charrette at Rocky Mountain Institute. And that event was a large-scale workshop on everything to do with refugees and climate refugees particularly. And out of that came the need for a shelter that could be folded back up and put on a truck and transported with the refugees when it became possible to resettle in the area that had been, for example, flooded. So they came to me and said, Vinay, you're an engineer. Could you do this? And I'm like, software engineer, I take a crack at it. So I went back to look at my assumptions that I'd made in 95. And 15 minutes later, had a back of an envelope sketch of a shelter that you could make out of whole sheets of plywood, just cutting them in half into particular triangles. And the assumption that was broken to make that work was the idea that the domes had to be perfectly efficient in terms of all of the points falling on the surface of a sphere, which was the core assumption. The sphere was the perfect shape, so you wanted to approximate it as closely as possible. Turns out if you're willing to relax that assumption a little and you're happy with kind of what we call neurodesic, it's not quite geodesic, it's neurodesic. It pooches out a little in some places and pooches in a little in others. If you're happy enough to make that compromise, you can use whole sheets and half sheets of plywood to make almost anything.
And today, how many hexayurts are out there in the world today? And my second question around those is, how long can you survive in one of those or live comfortably in one of those before you go a bit stir crazy, etc.? Or is the level of comfort or usability to a point where you can live them decently?
So the biggest of the Hexier family shelters is 460 square feet.
Okay.
So it's basically 28 feet across and 14 feet high. And if you think of that as something like a living room, and then you might have additional shelters that people would use as bedrooms, that actually sounds like a pretty good house.
Yeah, because you could essentially have multiple of these next to each other, and you have a little cluster, and you've got Bob's your uncle to use.
Exactly, and this is the sort of model where, in an emergency, you would put out one unit per family, and then if that moves into a long-term situation where the folks are going to be displaced for a while, in that situation, you can then come in and you can just keep adding additional shelters to ease up the overcrowding until everyone is comfortable.
I saw a video of you putting one together and describing the bits of it and the duct tape and things like that. What's the cost of putting one up today? At the most rudimentary level, what's the basic cost?
Roughly $500. So the material that you make them out of for temporary use is usually either plywood or polyiso insulation board. The good quality polyiso that is appropriately tough and fire resistant is about $30 a sheet, and you need 12 sheets or 18 sheets of that material. So $360 for that, and then to hold it together, you use filament tape that's used a lot in the packaging industry. And you might go through $50 or $60 worth of tape and then some foil tape over the top to protect that tape from ultraviolet light. And you need some rope and some anchors and some other stuff to tie it down. And it ballparks about $500.
Now, all of that work has led you to thinking about the survival of the human species in a very systemic way, right? And that's really the meat of this podcast, is how do we navigate the humanity's transformation? Right? From a Mad Max world to a Star Trek world, or scarcity to abundance, or whatever framing works best for you. I've thrown up a screen of a window that we have, which has the incredible work you've done called Dealing in Security. Okay, and I wondered if you could take us through that, because I find it utterly fascinating, and I think this is one of the densest pieces of thinking I've ever seen on how do you have humanity survive. So the title slide is Dealing in Security. Then we have SCIM individual. What's that?
So SCIM, pronounced SCIM, stands for Simple Critical Infrastructure Maps. So I spent about 5 years trying to figure out how to design large-scale refugee camps. And it wasn't a case of solving case by case. Here's your gear for deserts, here's your gear for, floods, here's your gear for, hot, wet climates, whatever it was. Because there are an infinite number of cases. People's needs are different. The available materials are different. What I needed was like a design language or a pattern language or a methodology, so that we could take a situation and then have the people that were available take the materials that were available and try and figure out how to put those pieces together into something that was a solution for keeping people alive. So to get there, I built on top of the Rocky Mountain Institute pipes and wires model. They talk a lot about autonomous building. So you have a building, and in and out of the building come a whole bunch of different pipes and wires and services, right? Clean water in, dirty water out, gas in, electricity in, telecommunications in, maybe natural gas in. And all of those kind of services are what turn the house into a kind of habitable unit, right? So I started thinking, like, well, if we're talking about refugee camps, let us imagine that you have your tents or your, small pods or whatever you're working with, and you kind of have some sort of notion of these pipes and wire infrastructures that are going in and out, and, like maybe you're substituting, and is a wood stove exactly the same as a gas stove? No, because you can also use the gas for heating, and, the whole thing became kind of complicated when I was trying to make it a parity between the first world services grid and the system design inside of a refugee context. And this was an abstraction problem. It was the wrong level of abstraction. So I went on a bit of a quest to try and figure out, like, what is infrastructure? So SCIM
is basically your perception and construct of the basic infrastructure required to survive.
It's exactly that. And what it allows you to do, because it puts individual survival in the middle of the picture, what it allows you to do is basically methodically work out from the individual level. Okay. The people are cold. That's a problem. Where are we going to intervene with the people being cold? Is it going to be clothing? Is it going to be tents? Is it going to be heaters? Is it going to be large-scale shelters?
So I just want to describe this map for the viewers, right? You've got kind of 6 things around the outsides: injury, too hot, too cold, hunger, thirst, and illness. And these are basically things that can cause you to die, right? And then you've got a set of layers like person, home, village, town, region, country, in the world, which are concentric circles. And we'll give people a link to this this PDF. And then the types of things that help you navigate each of those problem spaces. If it's too hot, you need cooling systems. If it's too cold, you need heating, etc., etc. We're on this. Injury deals with anything like with both accidental injuries like hospitals, and then violence like police and military, I guess, help you with that, right?
That's right.
Okay, so I'm in the US, so Second Amendment says injury, I should be able to have a gun at the personal level to protect myself. So is that deliberately left out, or is that the kind of, you were looking at the systemic thing, global perspective here?
So with all of this, what we're looking for is a layered model. So the reason we've got these layers from individual and household and sort of community, municipality, this kind of an approach, is because in any kind of disaster setting, what you have is a whole bunch of different agencies that are working. So you have municipal agencies, right? You've got your local police force. You have state level entities, which might be things like your, I'm trying to think whether you've got like National Guard, right? National Guard is organized at state level. Then you might have federal level, which would be something like FEMA. So the experience was basically this. What Skim maps is the places where people need outside assistance. So if people are armed, you know, in America with guns, in the UK, they can say stop, or I'll say stop again. Then in that sort of context, they don't need any outside assistance. You don't have to map it. Right. In the places where people need outside assistance, it's coming from one of these different layers of political bureaucracy. And mapping the bureaucracies is as important as mapping the threats, because the bureaucracies control the resources that protect you.
So on the next slide, you've got the kind of the 6 ways to die thing, which explains the different layers, right? Which I thought was, and it's really pretty exhaustive. I mean, those are the 6 ways in which somebody's going to have a problem or not. When you get into what is infrastructure, and talk through how do you describe infrastructure? On here, you've got electricity, drinking water, sewage, some communications, etc. You've said the most essential function of infrastructure is to protect us from the hazards of the natural environment, and then you've got other functions, etc. And importantly, you say here that infrastructure is a public health system, right? And I think that's a really important perspective. Anything you want to add to this in terms of how you think about infrastructure? Because this is a very unique way, and I think very important way, that people haven't seen before.
Thank you. I mean, it took 5 years to have the insight, right? Once I understood that the purpose of infrastructure is to keep you alive, then what happens is you get a unification of poverty, disaster management, and epidemiology.
Wait, repeat.
It becomes
poverty, disaster management, and epidemiology. And
epidemiology become a single field.
Right.
So if you think about control of waterborne disease, you know the story of the ghost map in London?
No, tell
cholera.
us.
So the invention of epidemiology is London has a cholera outbreak. And needless to say, this is sort of pre-Victorian, early Victorian. I mean, and it's a mess because London is hugely populous. A local doctor makes a map of all the cholera cases, figures out that they're in a circle around a specific well, goes out and takes the handle off the well, and then the cholera epidemic in that area slows down.
Hence, they find the dirty water source.
Exactly. And in reality, the story is much messier because the idiots then go and put the handle back on the well, and there's just it's the actual reality of that story is so much more complicated than the myth form of it.
Yes.
But nonetheless, this is the birthplace of epidemiology, and the ghost map is this kind of iconic thing showing infrastructure failure equals public health crisis.
Yes. We see that in Flint, Michigan, with all the lead and the toxins in the
water,
etc.
You see it with COVID, right? COVID is a public health problem because we don't clean air before people use it again. Right? You use the air, you breathe out, the air is not cleaned, somebody else then uses the air. If you were sick, they become sick.
Right.
And, Davos has just happened or is happening right now. And Davos is a sea of air filters. Every single space has a HEPA filter running in it.
Yeah.
Great. Common sense. Good. Like, let this become an aspirational goal because we should be cleaning air between uses.
Now, when you talk to governments, do governments think of it this way? Because this is a very unique perspective, and I've not heard this reflected in government discussions at all.
So I had quite a strong network at the Department of Defense. I used to, I was a contractor at one point for the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense, working on a number of different things, including a cryptography project, which is part of what became Materium. And there is an organization that kind of spun out of the side of DoD called StarTides, which is a civil-military cooperation network that's very focused on things like disaster relief. They do an annual demonstration in the Pentagon has at the center of it, there's a sort of park. Yeah. And in that park, they do a disaster relief demonstration once a year. And they build hex yards and they have water filters and they teach people about SCIM, and they've got lots and lots of charities with, sort of different technologies that come there to demonstrate. And people, take a little break from their day jobs, come down, have a wander around, pick up some ideas. It's really quite powerful.
Very cool. So let's go on in the slides here. You've got infrastructure, and then you've got the different layers of infrastructure. And talk us through, those seem pretty obvious to me. It reminds me of Stuart Brand's PACE layers in a different way, the concentric circle type of approach. Are there, and again, you put a lot of thinking into this. It seems pretty exhaustive to me. How did you come up with this? And are there any that you left out that you thought that could have been in here?
There is a previous version of this, which has a very, very nice additional layer to it. So it goes, individual, sort of personal, out the way through the layers until you get to global. The previous version of it had a layer beyond that, which made two observations. The first was that all of the water comes as rain.
Right.
The heat all comes from the sun, and the coldness all comes from space.
Okay.
And I took that out because it was a little mind-blowing for people, and the system was already kind of mind-blowing.
Yes.
But if you think about it, if you're outside and you get cold, you're getting cold because of the cosmic coldness of space is reaching down to the earth and sucking your heat away.
Right.
And the heat is the sun either shining on you now, or it shines on some trees and then somebody burns them in a fire, or it shines on coal.
Yeah.
Right. And, wind power is just solar power through a different capture mechanism. The only exception to this rule is nuclear, and that's coming from other suns. Not your sun, it's coming from some far off sun. And I thought that was kind of nice, but I left that out.
I can see how that would confuse people. Let me go on a very small tangent before I come back to this, okay? I have a degree in theoretical physics, and one of the often kind of convened discussions around that is that there are certain constants in the universe that are so perfect for the creation of human life and the sustainability of a Goldilocks planet, etc., that it can't have been accidental, right? What's your view of that paradigm of these constants in fine balance to keep life alive and survivability alive?
Yeah, what do they call this? The weak and strong anthropomorphic principle? Is that the thing we're talking about?
I think so. There's a bunch of things like the Avogadro number and the molar value and things like that, that all are at least particularly, and if one of them was off by like 1%, the entire heliocentric system and the entire way we look at the universe with space-time, gravity, etc., essentially would collapse, right?
Yeah, the whole thing goes off the rails.
So it goes into a conversation about, okay, were we designed, or are we in a metaverse or universe where it just happened to be in balance?
So I have done a lot of thinking about this, and I have a slightly different proposal on this.
Okay. I can't wait to hear this. Go ahead.
So generally speaking, the sort of notion is that you could imagine space-time as a single, non-moving, non-changing, four-dimensional blob, right?
Okay.
So 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time. It forms an enormous cube. The cube doesn't change, and then somehow our awareness moves through this thing, at 1 second per second.
Right.
Kind of sort. Now, my feeling about that is that 4-dimensional surface is manipulable from a 5th dimensional perspective, right? In the same way that you have things like a wormhole where you bend space in 4 dimensions as a way of connecting together 2 points in 3 dimensions. In 5 dimensions, you can then bend or warp or twist or expand or move things in and out of a 4-dimensional space.
Yes.
So my theory is that consciousness bends for space.
Pause. Let me just think about that for a second. Consciousness bends 4-dimensional space.
Yes.
Okay.
So you think about the past, you make decisions, and it changes what happens in the future, which would be a bend in all 4 space.
And to go into Deepak Chopra territory, do you believe that consciousness is emergent, mostly because of complexity, or there's a universal consciousness that we are an instantiation of?
My gut feeling about it is that consciousness is a physical phenomena, but it's a physical phenomena more along the lines of gravity or electromagnetism than an emergent phenomena like, say, fire.
Okay.
So I think that consciousness is sort of a latent thing in the universe. It's closer to a fundamental force than to an emergent aggregate.
Ooh, okay. So that bridges both in a sense. Okay, I like it. I'm just going to go back to this. You believe consciousness is that 5th dimension that bends space and time.
Well, so what I believe is that consciousness has the ability to operate to change the structure of 4 space. So if you think about the future, you decide you don't like what's going to happen, you then alter what you do. Some readings are that everything is predetermined and that 4 space is just static, and that's it's predetermined, you can make that choice. My feeling is that 4 space is mutable. That you make a decision and you then begin to change the shape of the 4 space that you're in.
This maps very well onto the phenomena that if you're in a near-death experience, time slows down.
Yeah.
Right? Or if you're in a flow state, you're essentially navigating that. Okay, love it.
Right.
I'm going to go back to the original topic because this rat hole.
We haven't gone to the anthropomorphic part yet.
Oh, go for it. So give us your view on that.
So here's what I think is happening. I think once you get some life, some consciousness, some awareness, something, right? I think what happens is that it starts to rewrite 4 space to be more and more and more compatible with its needs.
Okay.
Right? So my suggestion is that possibly what we've seen over immortal aeons is a very gradual shifting of the entire structure of 4 space to become more and more and more compatible with life.
Okay.
In the same, it's kind of, think of like a sort of Gaia hypothesis, right? The Gaia hypothesis is that all of the organic systems in the world manipulate things like climate to keep it inside of the habitable zone. Right, that life is very interested in stabilizing the conditions in a way that promote life.
And wants equilibrium and stability, okay?
Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing could be potentially happening at the level of things like cosmological constants.
Okay, so life manipulates the cosmological constants using
to make
this 5th dimensional consciousness, and that keeps us in a reasonable environment. Hence the need to be as conscious as possible when doing anything.
Well, maybe. And possibly in the far future, there are vast, super conscious cosmic civilizations that are actually slowly moving 4 space around changing their pasts to make it more compatible with them having a good future. Because physics has a very hard time discovering any reason why you shouldn't be able to move backwards in time if you can move forwards in time.
Yep.
So, what I kind of think is that what we might be is sort of inheriting the work of vast civilizations that we would see as being in the future that are actually going back and working on the fundamental structure of the universe to make it more habitable for them in the future. Which is, as daffy theories go, pretty daffy, but
listen, it's as good as anything that's out there. And I've always found when I was studying quantum mechanics and the fact that you could go backward in time at the quantum level, the vector is definitely there for doing that at a macro level. So why not?
Yeah.
Okay, got it. All right.
That's our physics break.
Okay, I'm going to come back to our systemic approach to the future of humanity for a second. Okay, now you've got also in your slides something called 4 tiers of cooperation, which is the individual, the group, the organization, and the nation state. And I'd really love to get into this. Tell us why nation state and why not say blocks of nation states or cities, etc. How do you think about that?
Okay, so before we go down that rabbit hole, let's take a minute and think about our the goat rodeo model.
Okay.
So the goat rodeo is a sort of a governance model, right? And what it basically says is that if you've got groups of people trying to work together, you can have here's your boardroom table. You've got a bunch of folks having a meeting. All of those people can want the same goal, so they can either be aligned or unaligned. And then organizationally, they can either be of the same kind of organization, so it's all government people or it's all charity people, or it can be mixed. Some military, some civilian, some charity, some corporate, all sitting at the same table. So this creates 4 possible worlds. Same goals, same classes of organization, which forms a cartel.
Okay.
Same goals, different organizations, which is cooperation.
Okay.
Different kinds of organizations with the same kind of organization with different goals.
Okay.
Which is conflict.
Yep.
And then the final problem is different kinds of organizations with different goals.
Right.
Right. And different organizations, they can't compete, right? A military a bureaucrat cannot compete with an aid agency. There's just no mechanism for them to have any kind of conflict.
Right.
Similarly, if you've got something like, humanitarian, you've got a set of humanitarian actors, and then you've got, for example, a journalist, right? There's no sort of notion that these groups have any of the necessary mechanisms for competition. Similarly, they can't cooperate because they don't want the same things. So they can't compete and they can't cooperate, and they're not a cartel. What we're left with is a group that has no possibility of resolving the problem. All they can do is talk.
Okay.
Right? And we have a very strong tendency to try and do the inclusion of all relevant and affected parties when we're doing decision-making, particularly humanitarian. But what that does is it creates a situation where you've got a whole bunch of people around a table that are all from different kinds of agencies and all have different objectives. And then the governance structure becomes completely paralyzed and unable to take any kind of action because they can't compete, they can't cooperate, and they can't form a cartel.
This is a very elegant way of describing why we can't manage the global commons, right? Because you've got different groups of different goals, and therefore, and no overarching governance structure that brings them together. So,
and this
go ahead.
This we call the goat rodeo.
Okay.
So the goat rodeo is a persistent governance anti-pattern. And that concept, frankly, of all the things that I've ever done, I think the goat rodeo is actually the most important single concept in all of my work. Yeah. Because once you learn to see the goat rodeo, you can see that almost every unsolved global problem is stuck in a goat rodeo.
I'm thinking about managing our EXO community, and it's like a goat rodeo in its own way. Why goat rodeo? Why goats?
There is actually a tradition in the southern part of America of before you have a rodeo with adults attempting to capture steers, you will have a goat rodeo with small children attempting to capture goats.
Okay.
And it's a fabulously chaotic process because goats have an acceleration. Like a goat can do like 0 to 45 in about a tenth of a millisecond.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, goat acceleration. They're like cats. You know, like when cats suddenly decide it's time to go, goats are like that.
Yeah.
And they're very, very resistant to being lassoed. So the goat rodeo is just this fabulously chaotic spectacle that is a thing.
Of kids trying to lasso high, fast accelerating goats. I think I may have seen a video of that somewhere. I think you've just described the UN in a magnificent analogy right there. It's a goat rodeo, basically, right?
Yep. The UN and global governance, because we didn't have a clear understanding of this as an anti-pattern, global governance is an interlocking series, right? It's an endless interlocking series of goat rodeos.
Right. That it is. So I've been reading some work by Patrick Ophuls, who wrote a book called Immoderate Greatness, talking through the 4 or 5 ways in which human civilizations have collapsed in the past, and the likely scenario that this will happen again, right? And I'll just, we're going to have him on, Mr. Ophuls, on in a separate podcast. But for example, human beings are not good at complex thinking or systemic thinking, right? Or we use up our resources and we are short-term thinking, etc. This brings about, and he basically looks at the history of the Incas, the Mayans, the Romans. Every civilization ever created has collapsed, and the conditions for that are. Do you believe, if you talk to the Yuval Hararis and Neil Fergusons of the world, the same factors that caused prior civilizations to collapse are there now? Do you agree with that?
What I usually say to people is the collapse is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Okay. William Gibson. Okay.
So I'll give you an example, right?
Yeah.
Homeless people have experienced civilizational collapse.
Yes.
It's just happened one person at a time.
Yep.
Right? So if you think of a civilizational collapse is kind of sort of like everybody becomes homeless and everybody becomes poor sort of at the same time. You know, municipal water stops working. You have to get out of the cities because there's no longer an adequate supply of food coming into the cities. You go back to the land, you start farming again. You know, the collapse of the Roman Empire took 300 or 400 years and the Romans didn't understand it had collapsed.
Yes, this is an important point. So if I go back to your 4 tiers of cooperation, you can have kind of civilization collapse at each of those levels. The individual thinks it's collapsing, the group thinks it's collapsing, the organization, and then the nation state is collapsing, right? And then you get...
So each one of those things has a different set of requirements to survive.
Right.
Individuals, 6 things are threats to individuals.
Yeah.
For groups, the groups have a different set of needs from individuals. So if you have a set of individuals that are all stable, whether they can form a group or not depends on their access to things like communications and transport.
Right. I'm going to go to the group for a second, right? Because you
take a look at the
individual. I'm showing the slide here. So you've got communications, space, transportation, resource control. Those are the things the group needs to survive, right?
Yeah.
All makes sense. Let's go to the organization. Organization, we have a shared map, a shared plan, and a shared succession model.
Yeah.
Interesting that you pick succession model in this, okay? This is to ensure survivability and continuity of that organization. How do you differ between the group and the organization?
So a group is a group of people that are capable of working together.
Okay.
But groups don't have any kind of overarching mission or purpose. So the group is the people that are there.
Yeah.
Right. So, you have a warehouse, you have some cars, you have, let's say, CB radios. You now have the potential to organize to do things, but the group exists whether or not it's organized to do something or not. Right? The group is the family unit, it's the neighborhood, it's the people that are there that have the ability to potentially do things together, but they have connectedness first.
Okay.
But the difference between a group of people that have those core resources to function as a group and a fire department is will.
Right.
What makes the fire department is they have an overarching mission, and everybody that is in the firehouse understands what the overarching mission is, and they understand the rules of the game.
Got it. Okay.
So shared map of reality is we're the fire department.
Yeah.
And our job is to put out fires, and we got some procedures for how we do that.
Okay.
Shared plan is your truck 1, your truck 2, your truck 3. You're going to the warehouse fire. You're going to this report that we've got that something's on fire down in the woods, and you're going down there to see whether there's any problem that we can solve with a pump and that whole flooding thing down at the bridge.
Right.
And that's your shared plan. And then the succession model is that the mission of the organization survives subsequent leadership changes.
Got it.
So if you have a shared map and you have a shared plan, but you have no succession model,
right,
what happens is the organization falls apart as soon as you take away the leader.
Okay.
So what really makes an organization is the fact that it transcends individual leadership. Anybody can lead as long as everybody agrees that person is the person who will now lead. So you need the succession model to be an organization.
Got it. Okay. Let's go to the nation state. We have some interesting elements here: jurisdiction, citizens, territory, effective organizations, and international recognition. Right? Talk through some of those. What do you mean by jurisdiction? It says here, states should provide an effective system of law and enforcement. I guess that's necessary. Even if you're an Afghan warlord, you need that system of control.
Well, so let's go back to Max Weber. Right? So Weber's definition of the state is basically that you have a single entity that has a monopoly on legitimate violence inside of a territory.
Yes. So I'd like to drill into that just for a second. I've heard you talk about this before, right? That the definition of a state is the legal right to enact violence.
No, not my definition. That's Weber's definition.
And who's Weber?
He is the great kind of historian and theorist of nation states.
Okay. So what's your view then of the state that differs from that?
So Weber's definition of the state is adequate for the state in non-distressed conditions. When the state is kind of sort of functional, Weber's definition is about good enough.
Okay.
But it breaks down at the edges.
Okay.
So if you think of something like a civil war, in that situation, you have two states that claim jurisdiction over the same area.
Right.
Right. And what's interesting about that is often what you'll get is not only you'll get two states, you'll get two sets of law.
Yes.
So here's this village. When the local warlord is here, everybody is under his rule and we do things his way. When the local warlord and his guys are somewhere else fighting somebody else, doing something else, we go back to using the village system that we always used before. Right? And Weber's model performs very poorly in a situation where you've got multiple different actors in a jurisdiction which are all acting in a somewhat sovereign way. So here's your army, here's your UN peacekeepers, here's the opposing army, here are the local villagers with guns. All of these things have effective partial sovereignty. And that condition is way more common than people think it is. There are huge tracts of the world which have 2, 3, 4, 5 different entities that are all sort of doing state-like stuff in layers on top of each other.
I guess the issue you have with it is when you say the state has the right, well, what do you mean by state? And who's the state? And there's people fighting over who the state is, and therefore it breaks down at that level. Okay, I get that.
But often they're not even fighting about who the state is. They're just fighting about extracting the oil. Right?
Yeah.
So many of the entities that wind up with state-like authority have no interest in state-like responsibility. And what you get is this kind of confusing mishmash of different actors. So like Horn of Africa, you've got a bunch of countries which are states, and then you have the US flying drone missions overhead and shooting people that it thinks are terrorists. And which one of those entities is the state in that situation? The only reasonable answer is both of them.
Yep.
Right? So the monopoly on violence breaks down at the edges as definition of the state.
Okay. And let's go back to your definition of the state then. What do you think how do you define it?
So my definition of the state is that the state is any entity that can proactively or retroactively pardon crimes.
Ooh, okay. Proactively or retroactively pardon crimes. Okay, and why that definition?
So, for the most part, the ordinary people have a pretty strong sense of what constitutes criminal behavior in their eyes. Right? Somebody walks into the town square, takes somebody else's car, and drives off with it. Pretty much everybody agrees that's a criminal action.
Right.
Unless that person is a bailiff and has a court order, or is a police person, or is a tax collector, right?
Yep.
Or is the son of the local warlord, right? And then what happens is that sovereign power takes this action that people would normally think of as being criminal and sort of blesses and says, it's okay when we do that.
Right.
Right? You pardon assault, you get police. You pardon murder, you get soldiers. You pardon theft, you get tax collectors.
Okay. Ha! Okay. That's
right.
Right, got it. Okay, so the state, it can do crimes and then pardon itself. And that's the definition of a state. Both retroactively and proactively.
Yep.
Okay.
So think of someplace like Chicago in the sort of height of mafia power in Chicago.
Yeah.
Right? The official state, the police, the state troopers, the mayor's office, and all the rest of that stuff exist in a kind of uneasy detente with the mafia. And the deal is basically the mafia are like, you don't touch that guy, because if you do, we're going to firebomb the mayor's house. Yeah. But these guys are bozos. You can have those guys.
I remember this conversation where in Mexico, where I was told that the police in Mexico don't report to the government. They actually report to the drug cartels, and they made a deal that, listen, we need our mules to be able to carry stuff back and forth without a problem. If you let us do that, we'll kick her the tourists and everybody will be happy. If you want the police to report to you and they start causing us problems, we're going to have a hell of a mess and your tourism will collapse. Which way would you like it? And the government basically said, much easier if this happens this way. It keeps the peace. Everybody's happy. There's an example of, I think, some of what you're talking about. The complexity is incredible.
The complexity is incredible, right? Okay. So the Weber model is very kind of European. It sort of works when you're dealing with pretty stable conditions and everything is kind of fine. But those are not really the places where you typically need a theory of the state. Right. The place where you need a theory of the state is when everything is going really, really badly. And then you have to be able to try to identify what's going on.
Okay.
So the 5 functions that we outlined there, jurisdiction and, citizenship and so on, those are all intended for the kind of Gupta theory of state rather than the Weber's theory of state.
Yeah.
So each one of the state-like actors has these 5 functions.
Right. I want to drill into the last one, the international recognition one. This is where I have the biggest issue I have with the network state concept that who is it? Has been
Balaji.
Sorry?
Balaji.
Yeah, Balaji Srinivasan has been talking about the network state. The book is phenomenal. And I've had the biggest issue with that because it's kind of easy to say, oh yeah, go get recognition. But that's a non-trivial thing to do. And there's enormous pressure against that. And I don't see it happening anytime soon. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So I did quite a bit of work on how you would start new countries. It was about 15 years ago. I was young. I was a little bit too libertarian. I was a little naive. And what I came to the conclusion is you don't want to be a state. You really don't want to be a state. Being a state is a terrible idea. What you want to be is a weasel, which stands for a weakly state-like entity.
Okay.
Right? You don't want to be strongly state-like. You don't want a UN seat. You don't want to sign international treaties. You just want to have de facto sovereignty over someplace the size of a resort town in which you can decide that the tourists are not going to get arrested for smoking marijuana, but they are going to get arrested if they bring cocaine.
Give me an example of an existing weasel state.
So if you think of, for example, Burning Man.
Yep.
Burning Man is para-sovereign. There is a whole bunch of crazy stuff that happens at Burning Man, and law enforcement has a pretty strong imperative to just not mess with that too much because, it's a huge tax generator. Plus, if you mess with the Burning Man people too much, they've got such an enormous amount of cultural resource behind them. If they have to change the government of Nevada to get the people that they want in charge of Burning Man to be able to get state troopers off their back, they'll do it.
Okay. In that same vein, then, the one that pops into my mind is Disney.
Disney is a fantastic example. It's actually much better than Burning Man.
Okay. Because they basically can tweak the laws, et cetera, as they see things necessary.
And what is it that Disney wants that Disney can't have, right? I mean, does Disney benefit from a UN seat? I don't see how it would.
No.
I mean, maybe they want to sit on WIPO or something like that. But, it's just not in their interests to be more state-like.
Okay. Charter cities, would that fit under your bucket?
Absolutely, right? Okay. As long as they are careful in their demarcation with the real state. Yes. So if we go back to our 5 functions, you need a map of territory, you need a list of citizens.
Yeah.
You need legal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
You need effective organizations, and you need international recognition.
Yes.
Right? Now, if I take international recognition off the list and we look at Disney, it's got a map of territory, which is the boundary of the park.
That's right.
It's got a list of citizens, which are the people that are inside of the park.
Yeah.
It has partial legal jurisdiction because it has an enforcement mechanism, and they make a decision about whether they need to call the police.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, did you just jump in line there? Oh, that's really naughty. Could you just go back to the beginning of the line? Not a police issue, right? It's like, how did you manage to become drunk and disorderly inside of a Disney park? Come on, knock that off. And then at that point, they either settle down, you call the cops, right?
Right.
So they have partial jurisdiction. They take care of some problems locally and some problems globally. And then they have massively effective organizations.
Yes.
They got their trash collection. I think didn't they have their own power plant at one point? I mean, they're just a massively well put together set of effective organizations, forming an organization of organizations, kind of like a team of teams.
Yeah. And
so they
actually have
3.5.
And I would argue they have international recognition just because of the brand power. I mean, the whole world takes their kids there for vacation, right? And therefore, you could argue they have international recognition in an interesting way. Fascinating.
3.5, 4 points, something like that.
Yep.
They've got, they're kind of close in on statehood, but not quite there, and they don't want to be there. The sweet spot for them is not to be more state-like.
So I would argue, you don't want international recognition. You want the international community to just know you and leave you alone.
Almost everybody who's in the business.
So this is why you say recognition, not membership. You just want recognition.
Almost everybody that's in the business doing like para-sovereign stuff is looking to be left alone, rather than looking to impose their will. Right. So, the purpose of being in the UN is you get to vote and you get to haggle and you get to try and change the international system to the benefit of your citizens.
Yeah.
Right.
What's your view of Balaji's work then on the network state? 80% fit and missing a couple of gaps, or do you have major issues with it?
So I don't really understand what problem it solves. Like if the world had 10,000 of these little statelets, most of them are going to be kind of like tourist resorts, co-working charter cities. Like, I think you'd get a lot more experimentation with law. I think it'd be helpful for dealing with ongoing issues like, the mainstream of psychedelics, I think, is going to be an utter disaster. But you could imagine having a few cities where you have a liberal attitude to psychedelics and you concentrate support services, and the rest of the country, they're fairly restricted. I think that there's just a sort of need for the problems that we face don't come from having too much governance. They come from having too little governance. Like, we need an accord on climate. We need to do something about nuclear weapons. We've got a whole bunch of massive global problems that the lack of sovereignty at the very top of the world allows to run amok. And para-sovereign, postcard countries, like, we had that in Europe for most of 1,000 years. Right. And it was no utopia. Recreating it doesn't seem like it solves any problem that I really care about.
So this is fascinating. So let me give you a viewpoint that's popped into my head, and you tell me if you agree with it or not. What you're saying is, actually, let me reflect back to you what I think you're saying with an example. So we have too little governance at the global level, so therefore no nuclear control, etc., and too much governance at the hyper-local level, where, you know, in certain countries I can't paint my house that color without the local village approving it, etc., to maintain continuity.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you know, but sort of, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is patchwork kingdoms is not a new model. Right.
Yeah.
When we had, you know, Europe was run by dukes and viscounts and all these funny feudal titles and stuff, these folks had enormous power to set up how things were going to work locally.
Hugely. My favorite example of that is Belgium, which was actually formed because the Duke of Flanders, which was part of Holland, and the Duke of Wallonia, which was part of France, got annoyed with the respective governments and got together and said, let's just hook up and create a country, ignoring the minor fact that you have different language, different culture, different systems of every kind. And there you have the mess that is Belgium.
Let's do it, right? And all those kind of not charter cities, but the what do they call them again? The free cities, right? Under the Holy Roman Empire, you had the free cities, and you had the what is it called again? Come back to me. You know, that trade network that was kind of up and down the Baltics.
My awareness of this is way less than yours. So if you're looking to me for a label,
I'm looking for the Hanseatic League. That's what I'm looking for, right?
Wait.
So Hanseatic League.
Wow, I've never heard that.
So
okay,
it was a bunch of free cities. So free cities and charter cities, quite similar, but that was under the Holy Roman Empire way back in the day. So the Hanseatic League was a network of free cities that agreed on some basic norms around trade and law. And they also had some collective defense stuff, and it was basically like a network of city-states that were kind of organized for mutual benefit. And it was really quite powerful and quite stable for quite a while.
Yeah.
Not a historian on that issue. So all of that sort of stuff, we've seen it work in the past. It could work in the future. For the upper middle classes, it might allow them to, you know, keep pet tigers and get stoned more often. But I don't see it as a solution to the fundamental problems of whether we're still going to have a human race in 100 years.
Yes. That's the fundamental challenge.
It's great, but, you know, I can live with a wide variety of equilibria about what color the outside of my house can be. I have real problems if we hit sort of like 4.5 degrees of global warming. I have other issues to concern me with.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, but I'm trying to get hold of a much bigger issue at the top end of the thing.
Agree.
Because that's where my problems are.
And I think that's where we want to be focused anyway, just because we've got a systemic and civilization threat. From the reading that I've done, it looks like we'll end up somewhere between 2.8 and 3.2 degrees of global warming. What's your view, and does that roughly sync up with what you've seen?
I think that's the current estimate, right? I think practically speaking, if we go back, for a while it was going to be 1.5 degrees, and every degree it's probably going to be 1.5. Then gradually it's going to be 1.8, it's going to be 2, it might be 2.4.
Right.
So we've been revising the estimate up from 1.5 to 1.8 to 2.1 degrees of warming. Maybe it'll be 2.4. For the past 20 years, 15 years, we've been slowly revising the estimate of how much warming we're actually going to see consistently. There's never been a point where we started to revise the estimate down again.
Yes.
So I just assume that 2-3 years from now, it's going to be like, we're looking at 3.1 to 3.4. We're looking at 3.3 to 3.5. And it's just going to continue to get revised up until somebody gets serious and is like, okay, we're stopping this now.
Wow. Okay, so this is, but at that point, it's way, way too late, is it not?
Oh, it's geoengineering. I mean, 15 years ago, you know Germain Cascio?
No. Oh, yes. Germain Cascio. Yes, right? I know Germain.
So I used to be Mr. Worst Case Scenario. Yes. Oh, Mr. Worst Case Scenario. I was quite like, oh yeah, I'm the worst case scenario guy. He did a talk at an event that I put on in 2008, and the mantra of the talk was desperate people do desperate things.
Okay.
And what he said was, like, we are not going to do anything about this problem in terms of restriction of carbon that matters at all. And as a result, we're going to be forced into doing geoengineering.
100% agree.
And it's just going to be luck of the draw, whether we do geoengineering and it works or whether we do geoengineering and it makes things worse.
Yeah.
And there's no other way that this can go. And then he gave a talk that kind of justified that position. And I was like, oh my God, what have you done?
I have a slightly more nuanced view. Can I give you that view and you tell me whether
Oh,
you
please,
agree
please.
with it or not? Okay. I do agree that nothing's going to happen. I do agree. Nobody's going to come up with anything. There's too much lobbying and vested interests, different sort of states having different objectives, etc. However, there are about 8 to 10 regions of the world that are highly at incredible risk. Miami, Florida, Bangladesh, places like that are Mumbai or Bombay that are totally existential threat. I think what they do is they get together and go, listen, the world's not doing anything. We've got existential threat. Let's just start shooting off cannons of material up into the atmosphere to stop sunlight. And they'll do it because they have to do it for desperation reasons, which is the point that you just made. And I don't see any way in anybody could stop it. And I don't see any way in how that doesn't happen. Give me your viewpoint on that.
Have you read Apocalypse by Fred Turner?
No.
So Apocalypse is probably the favorite book that I've read in the last 20 years.
Okay, hold it. Apocalypse, Fred Turner.
Fred Turner. Okay. So let me start by framing. It's a book about how humanity fixes climate change.
Ooh,
right?
Okay. Or
and it's about
what's the title of the book?
And it's about wildcat geoengineering.
Oh, very nice. Okay.
Now, that is great, and it's a great story, and it's a great story well told. That is not how it's my favorite book. Right?
Okay.
Of the last 20 years. My favorite book overall is Shockwave Rider. It's the most important book. And that's a long thing. Anyway, the reason that it's such an important work is it's written as epic poetry. And it turns out that epic poetry is a much better literary form for doing huge-scale science fiction sort of broad cosmic sweep stuff than the novel, because the novel was always about people's interiority. It was about what was inside of their hearts, what was inside of their minds, how they related to each other. Whereas epic poetry was about the doing of gods and monsters. And if you want to talk about cosmic forces and nanotechnology and geoengineering and the great sweep of civilization, it just turns out that epic poetry is a much better way of doing that kind of literature than trying to look at that situation through a tiny little human mind that's talking about their feelings in a novel framework.
Okay. Hence the Odyssey.
Yeah, hence the Odyssey. So it's completely magnificent. And I think the notion of like science fiction epic poetry as being like the right way of doing sci-fi, I wish we had 50 novels a year that were coming out as epic poems instead. It would be amazing. But he might be the only guy on Earth that could pull it off.
Vikram Seth might be able to do it.
Yeah.
He's got the poetry side down pat. Okay, so if you have this world where you have to do geoengineering, one of the conversations, I had a meeting with Sultan Al Jaber, who's now the CEO of the COP28 that's happening this year. And he's the CEO of ADNOC, right? And I suggested to him a problem that I'm seeing, which is nobody that I can see is doing research on global geoengineering. There's rain cloud type localized weather management people are playing with, but nobody's doing any research on the global geoengineering. And that seems to me a huge problem, given that the stark reality of it is that we're going to have to end up there. Do you see anybody doing anything around that?
Project Vesta is the one that I'm most familiar with. Grinding up enormous quantities of rock into powder and then dumping them in the oceans. The dissolved CO2 in the oceans makes the seawater slightly acidic. The acid reacts with the rock, that pulls the CO2 out of the ocean, and that frees up more room in the ocean to absorb more CO2. Looks pretty safe to try, not terribly expensive to run some experiments, not terribly expensive to do at large enough scale to make a big difference. Maybe?
Project Vesta.
Okay. And it has the advantage that it's the kind of stuff that we've got really good ability to scale.
Yes.
Because if you say to the global mining industry, we'd like you to grind up and crush 3.2 trillion tons of rock for us, please. Sure, that'll be $1.50 a ton, right? I mean, it's something where we've just got scalable
you can do
capacity.
That at scale. Yes.
We do it at scale, unlike a lot of the more complicated things that people are thinking about doing, which are things which seem potentially a lot less scalable.
and sucking, massive amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, will that hit? Has anybody run any numbers on that? Whether that will hit the kind of level of it? I remember talking to Al Gore about this, and I said, how big is the problem? And he said, it's you have to run every power plant and mine backwards 100 years, right? And that gives you the holy crap level of the scalable nature of that. Have you seen whether the Vesta, if you can grind up enough rock to do that?
My reading on it, they thought it was pretty plausible, and I kind of did back of the envelope, and it was kind of like maybe.
Wow.
And it's not the only thing like
it sounds like it would make a serious dent at a meaningful cost, right?
It really could.
The other one I've seen is planting, gajillions of trees. It turns out, by the way, that may be interesting because we've now got the cost down to 17 cents a tree. We can plant a tree via drones at 17 cents.
17 cents a tree. Also, lots of stuff about high atmosphere sulfur dumping. That's going to be weird, but might work.
Yes, that's the one I've seen. The what's called the Pinatubo effect.
Yep. And so the notion that we're going to get into an era where the dominant global discourse is which geoengineering solutions and what does the AI model of the climate say? It's like, okay, well, we're now basically in Bruce Sterling country.
Yeah.
It's a very Bruce Sterling world. Last year we did a bunch of consulting with Bruce. Bruce basically came in and helped us think about what we were doing.
Okay.
And wow, man is a powerhouse.
He is indeed. We did a panel of science fiction writers at X Prize with him, William Gibson, Corey, a couple of others. It was one of the legendary panels I've ever been part of.
He's outstanding. I was saying to him, if his life had taken a slightly different trajectory, he'd be running the Department of Energy. And I think that's true.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few people like that can think at that very systemic level and project out where things could go. There's a problem that you've pointed out to me in the past that I'd love for you to drill a little bit further into, which is that human beings have a limited spiritual capacity to deal with the enormity of the transformation that is coming our way. And you need incredibly broad resilience. Otherwise, your mind collapses into, I'm just going to go do that over there and forget about it because I can't cope. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So here, I guess we got to talk about the other thread in my life, which is I grew up in a very messed up environment. Both of my parents were mentally ill. I got therapy early. I also started meditation early. And therapy alone was not going to cut it for the kind of problems that I had. Meditation alone would not have cut it either. But this combination of meditation, therapy, and a few other things kind of, dragged me back to sanity by the time I was maybe 26, 27.
Okay.
Now, actually, I would say 25. 25 was where the real turning point was in terms of my kind of psychological well-being. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that the first level of cleanup, right? The combination of meditation, therapy, and potentially these days clinical use of psychedelics has the potential, I think, to straighten out most people most of the way in maybe 5 to 10 years of work of half an hour to an hour a day level of effort and maybe a few $1,000s a year between therapy and retreats to South America or whatever the hell people do, right? The fact that we don't have that as a sort of thing that people do, it's like, oh, you're a gym person, you spend a lot of time working out. Yeah, we got a clear archetype, protein shakes, those kind of tank tops, weightlifting. You never seen outside of it, far from a gym. We've good archetype for that, and we understand that produces a predictable, reliable transformation in the body and its long-term health. Right, it's a thing. The yoga people, vegetarian diet, lots of stretching, standing on the head. Maybe the better end of that, they're doing a bunch of pranayama. That's a thing. The therapy world and the meditation world have largely fallen into cultish swamps. We don't really have a performance-oriented therapy, right?
Let me
Nobody
just
comes.
performance-oriented therapy. I love this. I would say that it's happening informally. Certain leadership retreats. Chris Traub runs a Vortex retreat for mindfulness and leadership. It's happening, but on a very, very. It's certainly not systemic. And what you're saying, it should be a major movement to build leaders that have the spiritual breadth of shoulders to hold what's happening.
We've gone to the spiritual part, right? Okay. I'm just talking about the first cut emotional part.
Got it. Right? You're right. We don't.
And the crux of that, the fundamental pillar, is everything that we now know about post-traumatic stress disorder, and specifically complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
So there's a fantastic academic book, kind of pop academic, called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Lewis Herman.
Okay.
It's pretty much the Bible of sort of the clinical end of what we know about PTSD.
Yeah.
And just about anybody that either is a human or knows humans should read this book.
Trauma and Recovery, and what's her?
Trauma and Recovery.
What's the?
And the thing is, Judith Lewis Herman.
Judith Lewis Herman. Okay.
And it's not a self-help book, right? It's the academic understanding of what trauma does, and particularly trauma while people are still developing.
Yeah.
And once you get a sense of that, like you begin to understand a lot more about what's wrong with people, right? And trauma-informed therapy has still not really taken off in the way that it should have. Because the understanding that PTSD contributes to the vast majority of mental illness. You get structural damage because like your sister goes into anaphylactic shock at your third birthday party. Right. Nobody did anything wrong. Nobody died, but you wind up with a massively distorted world model because you think every time something good happens around you and people feel cheerful, somebody's going to fall over and nearly choke.
Yeah.
That sort of trauma is really, really common, and it hugely affects people.
Yes.
Hey, why doesn't Jane ever go to parties? Well, that thing that happened with her sister when she was a kid. And, it's not... I guess what I want to say here is that the process of being a small, fragile human child exposes you to a spectacular probability of being traumatized, right? We sort of think of trauma as being like your parents were alcoholic and they beat you with a hammer, right? And there is a small amount of that kind of like vicious intentional trauma.
Yeah.
And that stuff is, like, boy, howdy, that's a hard ride or a hard road.
Yeah.
But there's also tons of incidental trauma that just becomes, it's just there because children are to some degree eggshells in an environment made of careless people.
Well, it's simple as, your elder brother stole your fire truck when you were 4. You can make a lot of bad meaning out of that and have it scale to. In fact, the theory around some of the NLP work that Tony Robbins does, or landmark education, is that every child goes through a couple of instances of that where that goes really deep in their psyche. The question is how deep and how relevant. Sister going to anaphylactic shock would be at the extreme end of that for sure. I have a thesis that, if you went back a few hundred years ago, so I've got a 3-layer map of a human being with the soul, the subconscious, the conscious, right? And I talk about the human condition as us rotating that kaleidoscope so that the soul can shine out, right? Messi playing football is absolutely him in flow right to the soul level out on the field. And then you've got blockages at the subconscious level, blockages at the conscious level that potentially protect you. And we can kind of go into that. One of the few original bits of thinking I've done.
So that's a good model, because that, what I'm talking about right now is clearing up the conscious and the unconscious tier.
Completely. My thesis is that you take a Gandhi or a Buddha or a Jesus, they've done the work to totally cleanse that subconscious layer so that the soul is shining out always, right? And now we used to have old models, meditation, yoga, martial arts that helped you with that. Then we developed psychotherapy and NLP. Now we have biofeedback mechanisms and psychedelics that allow us to do this at a very effective level. The thing that got me incredibly excited about psychedelics was that we got to a point where you had a feedback loop, and you had somebody in an fMRI scan where you could see what dosage of what psychedelic did what to what neural circuits. Did it suppress it? Did it enhance it? And once we had that feedback loop, I got really excited. Right in the 60s, we were Timothy lyrics. We were chucking it down with no idea.
Firing people at a wall and seeing if they could hang on.
That's right. Now we have a complete feedback loop and amazing knowledge. It gets me so excited about the potential future of some of this.
Yeah.
But I do agree, the work needed to cleanse. I grew up in India like you did, and the amount of emotional crud that is built up in that country is over the generations of bad family practices is unbelievable. Right? Every family is a bucket of trauma sloshing around. I have a thesis that the entire
very common
an ayahuasca.
Very common in
at a billion people scale and just cleanse it all out in one shot.
And this is very common in cultures that were heavily colonized. All of that internal family stuff, right? Like, if you have families that were affected by starvation, affected by war, affected by 1,000 years of rule by invaders, all of those traumas that are cultural, historical traumas happened one family at a time.
Wow, that I've never heard. There we go. This is why
we're because where else can the trauma happen?
Yeah,
I mean,
it definitely happens
the historical
at the family level, but the fact that it happens because of colonization is predominant. I can't think of an example outside that. That's a great point.
Any civilization level historical problem, right? I mean, think of was it 548 or something? There was some year where there was a huge atmospheric eruption, and then there was a total global harvest failure, and a huge number of people died, and it was just it was totally horrendous, right? It doesn't matter where you were in the world. 75 years after that happened, you would have inherited trauma from people that you may not ever met.
Yeah, I mean, the clear examples of this that I know of are the Irish potato famine, right? That caused massive trauma in the Irish people. And the other one is the Holocaust. Because we now know from epigenetics that kind of a trauma takes 4 generations to slowly iron out, right? If you don't have the tools to navigate that, then it just keeps cascading down the generations. It goes down from parent to child.
So now, right, we take this understanding, right, sort of family distortion as cultural artifact, right? So, for example, my mother's family were Scottish, right?
Yes.
The family had gone horribly wrong when they lost their land in the Highland clearances hundreds of years ago, and basically fell 2/3 of the way down Scottish society, and at that point became manual labourers, albeit skilled labourers, because they weren't that dumb, right? And that as a trap, right? They were held in that trap for generation after generation because they couldn't accumulate capital because Scotland was a colony. Accumulations of capital would be taxed out of people's pockets, or they would be stolen by, manipulative lairds and stuff along these kind of lines. It was very hard to get out of that niche. And they blamed it all on the loss of their land. Right, they'd been made way over sheep, and they hadn't recovered from that over centuries. When you think of that, not in the context of the sort of the relationship between the Scots and English, which was uneasy but by no means genocidal, then you imagine what the trauma looks like in countries where it was gunboat diplomacy and trail of tears.
Yeah,
just having seen that in my mother's family, how long that trauma stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I by the way, the parallel is fascinating here. My grandfather was one of the biggest cotton barons in India. And the British were freaked out by how much power he had. And they bought some massive amount of cotton from Singapore, flooded the Indian market and wiped them out because they couldn't be. So we lost everything, basically. And so that I can see now as you talk about this, the cascading effect through 4 or 5 generations right down to today. Incredible.
Yep. And we're all in this mess, right?
Yeah.
Because over the previous 1,000 years, the trauma has accumulated far faster than the trauma could be cleared.
Trauma accumulated faster than it could be cleared. Yes. Agree. Right. And now we have, for the first time ever, ways of clearing up that trauma in a systemic way.
Would certainly help, right? And the scale of this, if you think about World War I to World War II, it's 30 years, basically.
Right.
right? How much of the damage of World War One had they really cleaned up by the time World War Two rolled around?
Oh, absolutely. My God.
Right.
Yeah. And we're still cleaning up that mess, I think, psychologically.
Well, I mean, you look at how weird the English upper class are.
Right.
You know, a lot of those folks went out World War One in red coats. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, I mean, there was a real massive cull of the English aristocracy through those wars. So I want to talk, like, this is the kind of, you know, mental and emotional layer that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That mental and emotional layer has to be cleaned up. And for most people, it's 5 to 10 years of effort on the same sort of level of effort that it would take if you were a gym bunny and you wanted to be able to stand on your head.
Right.
You know, like, you need to get therapy regularly. You need to do a bunch of meditation. You may or may not need the occasional trip to Brazil. You may discover that you need body work or rolfing or structural integration or integrated family, whatever it is.
Myofascial therapy.
Myofascial therapy, right? Absolutely. Ouch. Right? So you got to take this stuff seriously for long enough to get through the vast majority of the personal and cultural trauma layer. Right? That sort of gets people to the point where, for the most part, they can make up their mind about what they're going to do, and then they can do it.
Right.
And think of that as a kind of baseline ability. You decide what you're going to do, and then you could pretty much do it. Not in the sense of you write down your dream and then your dream comes true, but you decide that you're going to go running 3 times a week, and then you do. You decide you're going to stop drinking, and then you do.
Yeah.
You decide you're going to, you know,
your agency, basically.
You have agency, exactly, right? You're no longer being pushed around to quite the same degree. You have some steer. You know, you can steer the car. Then we hit the overwhelm, right? Like, okay, so I can do most things. Oh, but by the way, I'm also beginning to notice, like, there are things I can't do anything about that still directly affect me. Like, oh my God, the sky's on fire.
Right.
Yeah, we noticed that too. Oh, the sky's on fire. Bad feeling. Right? And then we hit the point where you're beginning to have to tap spiritual resources to be able to deal with this stuff.
Right.
Because the problem overwhelms the human personality. Like, nobody has a large enough ego to look at global warming and say, I could take that.
Yes.
Except
Elon.
Possibly Bono.
or Elon Musk.
Right?
Yeah.
So you get to that point where the human ego cannot conceive of solving the problem. Right? And at that point, you know, we don't sort of want cult-like religious belief, so we're going to pray to Saint Greta, and Greta will save us. No, Greta is a 19-year-old girl, albeit she does appear to be like the only equivalent we have of the Sorcerer Supreme. You know, that thing where she basically zapped Andrew Tate right into jail. Like, witchcraft.
That was amazing. Yeah.
Right? You know, just, I feel like, you know, they will write stories about this in hundreds of years. Like, oh, there was the great Sorcerer Queen. So, you know, nice to see a little bit of that kind of fantasy RPG thing coming over into our reality. So then, if we're not going to go into kind of cultish worship cults, and we're not going to go mad, what is it inside of us that is capable of acting on this problem? Right? Because the ego can't do it. It's too big. And nobody looks at that and says, I can do it. Right? God will fix it. Maybe not such a great approach. Smallpox.
Yeah.
Was a mixture, you know, like.
Pause for a second. You're one of the few people that has done it.
Sure.
Where are there people like you that can hold the climate reality that is about to hit us in full 3D view? Are there others that you met like you that can hold that overall space?
Well, so here I want to make a division between, like, the climate scientists, the activists, the people that are living fully in the climate world.
Okay.
Right? So for those people, they've all made some accommodation. They've got some way of coping. Some of those ways are healthy. Some of those ways are unhealthy. There is a lot of spirituality in that world. Some of it a bit fatalistic. Some of it a bit hopium. Some of it pretty well grounded. Right? Okay. So I haven't been through the whole climate scene recently. I don't really know who's who. There could be some fantastic leaders. A friend of mine, Dougal Hine, just did an interview with Vandana Shiva, for example.
Okay.
You know, said that she is just spectacularly good in person and an absolute powerhouse.
Okay, who's this?
Vandana Shiva.
Oh, Vandana, the dancing lady.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Vandana.
The Indian food sovereignty, I think, is maybe her
wrong
core
one.
plot.
Okay, Vandana Shiva.
Yeah.
We'll check that out.
Vandana Shiva.
Okay.
So her whole thing is basically sort of, the 1 acre farmers are going to starve to death and they're going to get nuked by Monsanto. If we want the world to work, we have to make it work for, the people that are literally growing their own food. I don't understand her position nearly as well as I should have. I may be misparaphrasing it, but that's kind of the approach.
Okay.
So she might be one. I think if you looked at, folks like Amory Levins, Amory is, he's nobody's idea of what a Buddha ought to look like, but boy, you want thinking done at a global level, he's your guy. So there aren't those kinds of folks, and there are a fair number of them, right? I think what makes me a little different is the way in which the load lands on me, right? So, I did the worst case scenario pandemic flu stuff, which was 2 billion person death tolls. I did a whole bunch of work on nuclear and specifically nuclear terrorism. Boy, howdy, you start thinking about individual day-by-day management of a post-nuclear terrorism city. I was under a lot of pressure to develop coping mechanisms. Right? And so what that did is it kind of forged a sort of response rooted in my kind of lifelong meditation practice, to some degree the therapy, to this existential thing. Right? And the thing that came out of that was, a sort of an easy holding of the magnitude of the problem, and it requires a certain zoomed back cosmic perspective. We don't know where people originate from. We don't know what happens to them after they die, but they will all die. The Earth itself has a limited finite lifespan of a few billion years, and then the sun will expand and cook the entire solar system. And so everything's already inherently temporary.
Yeah.
Right. Buddhists might say impermanent.
Yeah.
Right? And the thing that lifted the weight off my shoulders was this understanding that all of this stuff is inherently temporary. But what we're attempting to do is, within its temporariness, get a better outcome for the moment that it exists.
Yes.
Right. And being able to really root in that perspective allowed me not to feel like I was fighting the inevitable entropy and losing, but just that I was attempting to steer the descent path of an inevitable journey into death.
So you basically say, okay, let's fully digest the reality of impermanence, Earth ending at some point in a few billion years, and then you work back from that. That still requires a lot of muscle to build to deal with the immediate reality that's coming at us for the first time in human history, right? That at a global level we may have fairly big things happening, or will have big things happening, as we can see from all the events. What do you call that? What do you call that muscle? I would call it like spiritual resiliency. Do you have a label for this?
I teach a set of techniques which seem to be pretty good at producing it. Right. This is a side activity. I don't do very much of it because, I'm a CEO, I run a company. I'm not nobody's idea of a guru, really. But the thing about it is that it comes from the spiritual layer, but it is not the spiritual response that you would have seen from the spiritual layer 300 years ago. Right. It requires the combination of the old style, and I want to say authentic pretty carefully here, the old style authentic spiritual practices, right, in the new context of X risk.
Right.
So you're not saying, what did Shankaracharya say? What you're saying is, what would Shankaracharya have said if he was dealing with a culture that had a nuclear threat? Right? It's not a case of taking the old spirituality and attempting to replicate it. You have to learn what the old spirituality teaches, integrate it, and then say, okay, we are the generation that are facing this, and we have to make the call. And if you think of it as, the spiritual greats from the past, what would they do if they were here now?
Yeah.
Right? you get a very different answer from what did they do 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago,
Yeah.
when the problems were food distribution, taxation, war, avarice.
I remember talking to my dad, and he used to talk about the fact that Aristotle and Plato did amazing thinking about the world and the nature of reality, but they had no data to support or feedback loop. And today, with the scientific method and precision of instruments, we have infinite data to be able to cycle things through. I think today we could apply some unbelievable wisdom. And here's a question for you. Could we not take the old texts of all the wisdom, churn it through an AI, and then say, all right, how would Aristotle with this data set operate?
Yeah, I think you could absolutely take a crack at it. Whether it would produce anything useful or not, this is an experiment to be run.
Yep. Okay, so I want to bridge now to what you're doing and how you're handling all of this. We are going to run out of time today. So are you open for a part 2 of this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Absolutely.
So let's set up as the final part of this conversation, set up part 2 in terms of, we've kind of, I think, done a good treatment of the nature of the problem of humanity, civilization writ large. Let's bridge to how you're thinking about the future, and that'll set us up nicely for a part 2, which I definitely want to do, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers will want to do. Over to you.
I did this long shift on worst case scenario stuff, right? I was working mostly for military think tanks. I did some of it freelance as well. Worst case scenario pandemics, nuclear terrorism, just failed states, civil wars. I was kind of notorious. I used to carry a business card that said I don't get out of bed for less than 1% mortality. Read the old joke about some model said I don't get out of bed for less than 10 grand.
In fact, that model was, God damn it, Linda Evangelista.
Okay, there we go.
The reason I know this very well is that I grew up in high school sitting next to her in class because they place you alphabetically, and E was close to I, and we'd end up in class next to each other. And so I've watched her career through that. So bizarre.
That's hilarious.
Yes.
So
wait, I want to go back to you. Explain what you mean when you say I won't get out of bed for less than 1% mortality. What the hell is that about?
Oh, if the scenario wasn't going to kill 1% of the population, I wouldn't work on it.
Okay.
Because there are lots of scenario planners that are capable of doing, sort of scenarios to kill 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000. They can work on that.
So you want 1 in 100.
I cut my bones on the 50-50 scenario, which was half of the human race catches a disease and half of that half dies.
Yeah.
And civilization collapses. So that was the hard job that I did. And nuclear terrorism stuff is just super unpleasant because you're dealing with radiologically contaminated populations staggering out of cities, and then you got to figure out what you're doing with it. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right. So that put me under a lot of pressure. I had a lifelong meditation practice. I'd gone through the therapy cycle, but I was now in a position where I was having to figure out how to cope with the pressure applied by this kind of extremely intense risk stuff that I was having to model in minute detail to come up with effective planning responses. I had to really internalize the entire thing. And then when I came back to thinking about climate, that set of tools were now available. So what came out of that was a meditation course called The Cutting Machinery, where I basically looked at everything that I knew about meditation, looked at everything that I'd seen go wrong in terms of the total disaster, which is the guru-disciple tradition in the West. And I basically built a meditation process which is intended for individual practitioners with practically no oversight. So,
interesting.
Right? It's an hour a day, so it's extremely aggressive. An hour a day is very aggressive. It has a bunch of internal stabilization mechanisms that allow people to do an intense practice without sliding. I do one check-in with students after 6 months to make sure that they're performing the technique correctly. And other than that, the instruction is basically, call me if you start getting enlightened or if you run into any kind of serious trouble. And this thing's been out there for, I don't know, probably about 6-7 years at this point. The first person who came off that process has entered the sort of serious foothills of enlightenment. I've got probably 200 or 300 people who've been practicing it for multiple years, probably a half a dozen to a dozen who are now getting pretty mature. And mostly it seems to appeal to folks like doctors, soldiers, paramedics, people that have seen quite a bit of death in their day job. Psychologists, generally people that have already started to kind of face down the darkness of the world, seem to be the people that course works for. And it is mandatory that people are in therapy when they're doing it, because that, if they're not, the meditation will bring up material they've got no way of processing.
Yeah.
So this notion of having people lean quite hard on the therapy takes an enormous amount of the load off the person teaching the technical meditation practice. And the other important part is we don't let them talk to each other, right? No Sangha, no mailing list, no forum, no community, none of that stuff. Do it on your own, almost Theravada style.
Yeah.
Because all the spiritual communities seem to turn super toxic.
In a group setting.
It doesn't matter who's teaching, the community will be toxic. So at that point, we just don't have a community. And we basically, the emotional support function goes out to a therapist who hopefully is a professional.
Wait. Okay, let me just stop for a second and get my head around this. Group-based environments turn toxic when you're doing this kind of work. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yeah. It seems to be like, it doesn't even seem to matter how good the teacher is. The community seems to wind up toxic under pretty much all circumstances.
I'll give you two examples where I slightly disagree, and you tell me your reaction. Tony Robbins.
Don't know anything about that community.
Landmark Education.
Lots of people think it's a cult, and it seems to rewire people in a way which is not terribly good for their individuality. It's a little bit like a military boot camp where you just give people an operating system and then they take it off and run with it. It's not quite what I was hoping for.
Yeah. Okay. And Tony Robbins results in idol worship to some extent.
Well, I mean, if you're going to have millions of people doing your thing, they are going to idolize you to a degree.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't matter whether it's pop music, writing fantasy novels, or teaching people how to be more effective in business.
Yeah.
There's always going to be this thing of like, people want to believe that their heroes are phenomenal. And that's fine. I mean, I think that's okay to a degree. But the question is, should you have, like things like meditation, so much of the personal work has to be done one-on-one.
Yes.
The guru doesn't scale to 25 million followers.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas if you put the load on therapists, the therapists do scale.
Okay, so what you're saying is you've created a technique where the processing of emotional trauma can be offloaded to the therapy path, and that leaves the person with this self-management process of meditation that can pull them into spiritual awakening.
And this approach of putting the emotional load on the therapist rather than on the community of the teacher generally keeps the process remarkably low drama, because the drama is professionalized by having therapists. And the therapy approach is we tell people, get your own therapist, and they shouldn't be anything to do with this community.
Yeah. Okay.
They shouldn't be anything to do with this practice.
That keeps it clean.
Right? We don't want in-house therapists because, I mean, my guru told me, like, Vinay, you really shouldn't teach. You're kind of too much of an asshole.
Okay.
And that was broadly speaking true. I tended to be quite a ferocious teacher, like, like there was a lot of stick and not a lot of carrot. And, my guru was that way to a degree, but, I had it worse than she did. So I also saw that there was just this wasteland and nothing interesting was happening in the spiritual world. We wound up with the same disastrous attempts to take Indian technology, port it to the West. It would go horrifically wrong in a number of totally predictable ways, and we didn't seem to be able to get out of the loop. So eventually, I'm like, okay, I'm not really meant to be teaching at scale. I accept that I'm not characterologically well suited to be a teacher of the conventional form, but I think this will work. Let's give it a try. And I ran that specifically because I thought it was going to take about 10 years for me to get a bunch of spiritual superheroes out the top end of that practice. And then those people are people that I could delegate to when it started to get time to do things like Hexia at refugee camps, because I don't scale. I needed people that I trusted to make the same decisions that I would, or better ones.
Love this.
And to get those people, I had to bring them up through the path that I had left behind me.
Yeah.
Now at the point where we've got half a dozen people coming out the top end of that process,
okay,
who are pretty much what I was hoping for. One of them, in fact, is a lot tougher than I am. That guy is staggeringly more psychologically durable than I am, and that is something I'm like, where did you come from?
So I got to give you some feedback here. So I've done a bunch of this stuff. Landmark education, I've done like all of it. Tony Robbins, a bunch of it. Peter introduced me to Tony, and I've spent some time at some of his courses. And then therapy, marriage counseling, psychedelics, etc. I'm really liking the approach you're taking. I see the toxicity that can come from group environments. Landmark is actually one of the best products I've ever seen with the worst marketing I've ever seen. Because they're just terrible at getting the word out about what they do. The actual, because they use newly minted graduates who are evangelicals as hell to promote, and then everybody goes, "Oh my God, it's a cult." Right? The underlying model is powerful, and because you don't have a single figure, you step away from the authority level issues that you get with some of the other ones. But the perception absolutely is a mess, and there's definitely truth to that. It's valuable coming in with some spiritual strength, which I had from India and doing Buddhist meditation, etc. Then it gives you the layer and language of processing, which I think is very strong.
Very important.
But the approach you're taking, I absolutely love it, because you can navigate the trauma and difficulty of the emotional stuff. It doesn't get offloaded to the community, and you still get better. So I'm totally thrilled with this, and fascinated to hear more, which we can do. So as you breed these and grow these new kind of leadership, spiritually strength and resilient, what do you do with them?
Nothing at all, right? Okay. It turns out most of them are already fully deployed.
Yeah.
Right. So, they're working on something. Most of them, it turns out that most of them already have quite heavyweight, meaningful careers. They're doing things that are very emotionally challenging. They're already working on some part of the global crisis. And so basically, they're just getting better at doing the thing that they're doing. And the only people that seem to be really interested in the practice are the ones that are trying to save the world and are looking for more.
There's self-selection at a natural level that goes on there.
And that's amazing, because I've been able to, this sounds terrible, but I've been able to more or less completely neglect that community, and it continues to run. I keep using the word community. I don't mean to. I've been able to more or less completely neglect that set of people.
Right.
And they continue to do the practice, and they continue to evolve forward. And I think that's almost entirely due to them having the therapists to talk to, rather than always needing me. It really seems to work.
Well, then, that's actually the holy grail, right? You can kind of step away, and the process just keeps, that carpet just keeps unrolling.
Just keeps running. And then there are the points where you begin to get the real sort of spiritual breakthrough stuff, where people do have to come back and talk to somebody that really understands the spiritual component. But if they can get through the first 9 years with 3 hours of input from somebody that's in that category, then when you finally get to the part of doing the final straightening out of like, okay, so what does it mean? I saw all my past lives. Well, that's not quite what it looks like. By the part where you finally need to wheel out the Yoda act, at that point, you only need a limited amount of that. And I think it minimizes the probability that the guru's flaws will wind up screwing up the students.
Right.
Because they've come so far on their own. What the hell do they need you for?
Yeah. Fantastic.
So worth a try. Right?
So in part 2, I'd love to delve a little bit more into this.
The practical. So let me nutshell what I'm up to these days, right? So I'm CEO of a little tech startup. We've been around for 6 years.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to build is the data layer, which is necessary for international shifting of the economic incentives into sustainability.
Okay.
And I'm not working on the energy aspect of that. I'm working on manufactured goods. So if we can change the incentives that produce landfill capitalism, and we can move it into either circular or spiral capitalism, we could take the existing market infrastructure, we could get the landfill out of the equation, we could continue to run manufacturing, But you manufacture goods which are incredibly durable. So after they're out of fashion in New York, they wind up in Iowa. After they're out of fashion in Iowa, they wind up in Mexico. After they're out of fashion in Mexico, they wind up in Peru.
Which solves the planned obsolescence problem, which is
Planned
pervasive in
obsolescence
capitalism.
is the devil,
Yeah.
right? And if we could get rid of that, I mean, I know one or two really seriously, old school, rich English posh people, and they've still got their chairs have been reupholstered 13 times in the past 300 years.
Yeah.
Right? That's the kind of thinking that we need if we're going to be able to do sustainability, because resources are genuinely as scarce now as they were 400 years ago when that kind of culture was established. Like if you take the world's resources and divide it by 8 billion, let me tell you, we don't get very much each. Right.
Absolutely. During the pandemic, I tried to wear the same pair of trousers for 30 days in a row. My wife intervened and wouldn't let me. So the aspiration is absolutely there. Vinay, this sets us up nicely, I think, for part 2, which I'm going to go research some of these topics, Vesta, etc. It occurs to me right off the bat that Tom Chi, who you probably know, would be a good guest to have to discuss some of the numbers around some of this. In the conversations I've had with him in the past, this would be perfect. And when in the part 2, I want to delve much more into Materium and specifically the problem you've solved, because I think many of the people that are listening to this or watch this will be by default interested in some of that.
I mean, I think what I have here is a new climate stabilization wedge. Right?
Yes.
The climate stabilization wedges are, they're not all the possible wedges. I think I have a new wedge, and it involves taking some aspects of the old culture that we had before industrial mass production, bringing them back in a context where you have a high-tech data layer to change the incentives. So the critical insight is this. If every time something like a bicycle is sold, the original manufacturer gets a cut of the money, the manufacturer is incentivized to make a bicycle which will be sold over and over and over again.
Yes.
And what you need is a data layer which says this asset has been resold. You, the manufacturer, have recertified it, refurbished it, repaired it.
Yeah.
You now get a cut of the transaction, and that will continue for as long as this object exists.
Which is one of the most fascinating things I noticed when delving into NFTs is built into many NFT projects is this subsequent resale model, which really makes it interesting. So,
and that's how we bump. This is how we bump ourselves out of landfill capitalism. Because what I want is for the bicycle manufacturer to say, if that bike is in a landfill, it's not earning me any money.
Right.
But if it's on the road, it's earning me money.
Yeah.
But the trick of this is we don't want that to be, it's a smart bike and it constantly taxes you every time you ride it.
Yeah.
Right? Not the way of doing it. The manufacturer has to do some work in return for their money. And the work that they do is recertifying and refurbishing.
Absolutely.
And this approach where every manufacturer is constantly recertifying and refurbishing, anytime something winds up as scrap, they stop earning.
Right.
Right. But if you buy it and you just keep using it, you don't have to pay. So you're not in a rental model, you retain agency. Yes. And because it's a buy model, not a rent model, you keep capital in the hands of the people. So economic democracy, environmental sustainability, and a resetting of the incentives of capitalism so that companies no longer profit from landfill. And what this does is it closes the escape routes for value from human civilization. And then we continue to accumulate value inside of civilization, which means we can share more value with the poor.
Yeah.
Because rather than the value...
And that's the path to abundance.
It's a path to abundance. Because what we don't want is the value leaking out of the manufactured world into landfill and into basements and attics, which are just filled with junk nobody wants. What we want is to seal up the exits from value so that we can continue to accumulate the value and gradually expand the circle of people that have access to good stuff. And if you think about cell phones, right? If cell phones lasted 20 years rather than 5 years, which they easily could and what old Nokias do, all of the phones which are currently sitting dead in people's drawers, which are broken, which wound up as e-waste, whatever it is, every single one of those phones would have a user somewhere in the world.
Absolutely. I mean,
and how do we change the incentives to get that world?
This type of cyclical spiral approach works quite well in places like India, where there's the bottom will do whatever they can to grab whatever resources they can. But you've found a
Absolutely.
way of systemically applying this into the Western world, which I think is going to be just a fascinating discussion to have. Excellent. All right.
Forward to it.
On that note, Vinay Gupta, thank you so much for being part of this podcast. I can't wait for part 2. We will get together and schedule it as fast as we can. But until then, thank you for being with us, Vinay Gupta.
Really marvelous talking. Thank you.
All right. So that was an episode of one of those where we delve into a million topics. I can't wait to bring Vinay back again. I'm going to wrap it up here. Everybody have a great day. And this has been the Salim Ismail Podcast.